Hi, my name is Aubrey Sass, and I'm representing the Phoenix Group today. Our presentation is entitled Introduction of Cross-Cultural Communication Training. Why Cornerstone should implement nonverbal cross-cultural communication training for persons traveling abroad is the topic we'll be exploring. Also in my group is Coley Swistak, Megan Tracy, and Caitlin Spencer. Our thesis is this: Cornerstone should provide cross-cultural communication training in order to increase cultural sensitivity in communication, with the understanding that the communication as a whole may not necessarily be improved.
To begin our presentation, we will explore two different research topics. The first is a study on communicating disagreements among Malaysians, verbal or nonverbal. So we will look at the difference between indirect and direct communication, and also at using silence as a communicative method. Our second study is listening and nonverbal communication training, presented by Susan Tim and Betty L. Schroeder.
This study was done at a university, and students were given a certain amount of training in which the results of the study showed whether or not that training was effective in interpreting nonverbals. Why is this important? Well, first of all, encountering new cultures can be stressful and scary. For any of you who have been outside of the borders of the United States, we know this to be true. Persons with a missional purpose should be prepared to interact with new cultures. As Christians, we are on mission for Christ, and sometimes that mission will take us to cultures in which the practices and behaviors are different than our own. So this is something that as believers we should be prepared for. And ultimately, understanding the culture one is trying to help will help to understand each party's side of an argument.
We believe that Cornerstone should implement this training before any students go on short-term missions or long-term study abroad programs. The advantages to this training would be knowing how to communicate directly or indirectly with the people you encounter during your travels. Also being able to recognize what body language means so that you're more perceptive to the culture that you're entering and you can avoid being offensive. Also, you can understand that silence means different things in different cultures and that you are aware of these implications in the culture that you're traveling to. Another advantage is understanding that you are a foreigner and that nonverbal and verbal communication are both very important during your travels.
The research methods in both studies used objectivity, rationality, and the use of the empirical.
All of the conclusions were drawn from the process of induction and processing the data that was gathered during research. The observations they found were used in the induction process. The studies showed objectivity because of the control groups that were used in the second study specifically, and then analyzing them without using presuppositions. Even though the Malaysia article did describe presuppositions in the introduction, they were led to change their hypothesis at the end because of the information that they received during the study.
And just to touch on the empirical a little bit more, we all know that the empirical is all of our senses, and so both of these studies obviously showed this method very strongly, as in looking at people's facial expressions, their body language, using sight, smell, sound, all those kind of things that are not verbal.
So I will be presenting our first supporting research topic, which was the communicating disagreements among Malaysians, verbal and nonverbal. This study went into a lot of how the Malaysian culture uses a lot of indirect communication, including being silent. So the study was meant to examine how three different ethnic groups of Malaysians, which is Chinese, Indian, and Malay Malaysians, responded to disagreements among both the family, friends, and in the workplace. The findings indicated that Malaysians all seem to communicate verbally during disagreements, but that there is less verbalization when they were faced with disagreements in the workplace. There was also some slight variation between the ethnic groups. So some relevance that we can glean from this research was that even among the same culture, sometimes different ethnic groups may respond differently to disagreements. So it's important to learn those differences because even the smallest ethnic groups, even among the same culture, can be different, and it's important to understand that. It's also interesting to notice that it is possible to quantify the culture's overall use of verbal communication versus their use of silence, which is what we were talking about in the empirical. This also the study gives us insight into a culture that is less direct than our own Western societies, because the study showed that many Malaysians are less likely to verbally disagree with their bosses because of the hierarchical structure in the workplace. Whereas here in the US or in other Western cultures, it's not as important to show respect for your superiors or your elders. Because we are very individualistic, we may not show the same respect, and we may have the same level of verbal confrontations with our bosses as we would with our family members. When we enter into another culture, we're ambassadors for Christ, so we need to realize these things and understand what will cause offense. If we don't enter into relationships in a respectful manner when going into another culture and realizing kind of our place in the hierarchy, it can be very offensive. And we also need to figure out when it's appropriate or inappropriate to disagree or voice our opinions. In this experiment, there was no control group. The sample size was 655 and was chosen based on accessibility. So although the majority were Malay, then there was a small group of Chinese and an even smaller percentage of Indian. So the groups weren't evenly tested. The subjects were assigned to groups based on their ethnicity, and the independent variables were the different groups of people the subjects interacted with, and the dependent variable was their reaction to disagreement, whether verbal or silence. The results were displayed by graphs and text, and the information given was almost enough to replicate it. The study was peer-reviewed and published by 10 editors with PhDs.
Our second study that we looked at was called Listening/Nonverbal Communication Training. And the purpose of the study was to analyze the influence of listening and nonverbal communication training on an individual's level of multicultural sensitivity. It claims that, quote, listening to someone requires people to attend to more than just the words being spoken. They must also observe behaviors. This study also asserts that people who are active listeners are more aware of nonverbal messages and more apt to communicate effectively with people in their own and other cultures. Unfortunately, most people receive little or no training in either listening or nonverbal communication. So as a result, the research found that participants didn't necessarily gain more knowledge of communications, but their overall cultural sensitivity increased. So why is this study relevant? Well, first of all, it was done on college students at Indiana Northern University, which is so relevant to us because we are college students and we are studying abroad quite a bit of us are. It also talks about how nonverbal communication increases cultural sensitivity, which is the assumed goal of Cornerstone training students on this topic, right? We want students to be more sensitive as they venture out into the world. And the study was completed just over 2 years ago, so findings are recent. This isn't something done back in the hippie era. Northern Illinois University, where the study was conducted, is in the Midwest, obviously just a couple states away, so that's in close proximity to us. It's in America, so it's also culturally relevant. There was a control group of 40 students. The sample size was 74 students. So at this university, they looked at 4 different randomly selected classes. 62% of the study was female, so that is the majority. Subjects were randomly assigned to groups that were assigned training and then those that were not given training. The independent variable is the training given to students. So certain students received a 2-hour segment of training on cultural sensitivity and reading nonverbals, and the dependent variable was the test results, right? So how did students who took the test compare to those who did not? The results were displayed by tables as well as text. And there was absolutely no anecdotal evidence. So no stories, no personal testimonies, nothing to kind of tell us how the people who participated in the study felt. And the study was peer-reviewed, which is important to note.
So understanding how we are biblical ambassadors to the world and how what kind of connection this has to our faith. When we read the Bible, obviously we approach it with a hermeneutical approach if we're reading it correctly. So our desire is to bridge the gap of the ancient Near East to our own current culture. And we believe that if we're going to do that with the Bible, that we need to do that also in our cultures today. In order to make the gospel culturally relevant to others in our world, we can't just come with our own presuppositions. We need to understand how they will be reading it, and then how they'll be understanding it, and how we can help them to understand it correctly and in their own cultural context. And also, we discussed the idea that as ambassadors of peace, that we need to work to understand the cultures we're entering into, because it's been proven in peace studies that we are more inclined to find peaceful relationships and harmony with people who we understand or who we feel like we know. So it's very important for us going in for the cultures that we're entering into, not to view us as outsiders or foreigners or trying to change their culture or trying to change who they are, but to come in as peaceful ambassadors and showing them that we care about their culture and that we love them and that we want to foster an understanding between the two of us.
So to conclude, we believe that Cornerstone should offer nonverbal communication training to students who are planning to study abroad, because our study found that over a long term, short periods of training are very effective. We would propose very short periods of 1 hour long training once a week for the 3 weeks leading up to their trip. So they would have 1 hour of training a week to reflect on that training before the next hour, and that would happen the 3 weeks leading up to their trip. So the topics that would be discussed during the training would be direct and indirect communication, body language, and they would use examples from various cultures, because we found in our study that was actually one of the most important things to increase cultural sensitivity, was that the examples and situations used during the training were from multiple cultures. The students would be then given a reflection period following their training in order to process what they've learned and to have that become part of their attitude leading up to their trip.
And I think it's important to note that training in nonverbals and in the way we communicate with other cultures cannot hurt at all. It can only help us in understanding the world, and as we travel and being prepared to interact with different people and different styles of communication, we become more well-rounded individuals, and this training would only allow us to connect more deeply with people that we should meet and give us opportunities to share Christ, and ultimately just to bring His light to places that are dark in the world, and just to commune with other believers even in different countries. This is very important. All of us have studied abroad during our time at Cornerstone, and I think that we all, had wonderful experiences, but we possibly could have benefited from a bit more training. So going forward, we think that this is important. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to our presentation. We hope that you learned something, as we certainly did.